irá me compreender pelo título da minha apresentação, vou fazer a comunicação em inglês. No final, se tiverem alguma questão, terei todo o gosto em desenvolver algumas temáticas em português se considerarem pertinentes. Então, o título da minha comunicação é The Liberal Government 1905 to 1915 and the Origins of the Welfare State in England. We need to bear in mind, when we talk about the beginning of the 20th century in England, that there was a growing concern with social reform in the first decade of the century, and to a great extent due to the consequences of the Industrial Revolution and the progressive mechanization of society throughout the preceding century. And after a period of severe unpopularity, pessimism and lack of cohesion within the Liberal Party, the Liberal Party won the elections in 1905 and gained 216 seats in Parliament, while the Unionists, the previous government, lost nearly 250. So this was a major victory for the Liberal Party at the time. Actually, Rubinstein considered this government one of the greatest and most memorable in British history due to a lot of reasons, especially the connection that scholars usually establish between this government and the beginnings of the welfare state in England. So the first Prime Minister of this government was Henry Bannerman from 1905 to 1908, and he, from the very beginning, he started to show some concern with the poor, and he supported compulsory education as well. However, it was only with Asquith, who succeeded him in 1908, from 1908 to 1915, and especially due to the action of Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, that this government began a more systematic implementation of interventionist measures and was actually concerned with social well-being. Namely, because of the People's Budget. The People's Budget was a very important initiative of this particular government. It was approved by the House of Commons in 1909, but it was only approved by the House of Lords a year later, in 1910. And it aimed at implementing measures of interventionist social reform precisely in order to fight against some of the negative consequences of the Industrial Revolution. These are only some of the measures of the budget. It imposed limits on the power of the House of Lords. It implemented the subsidy for the unemployed, which did not exist before. New taxes on the incomes of the wealthier, higher taxes on unearned income, taxes on land, duty on petrol, duties on liquor and tobacco. So these were only some of the measures that were actually a part of this budget. However, and even though there are a lot of academics who look at this period as the potential origins of the welfare state in England, there is no consensus regarding this conclusion, because usually there are 4 different periods pointed out as being the starting point of the welfare state. The first one, the Elizabethan Poor Law in 1601, so much before the 20th century. The second one, the Victorian age itself. The third one, the Liberal government I have been talking about in the last few minutes. And the last one, only in the middle of the 20th century, the labor initiatives, which took place from 1945 to 1950. So, different interpretations regarding the potential origins of the welfare state in England. As far as the first interpretation is concerned, it is true that there was a concern with poverty, demands for minimum standards of living, state intervention and welfare measures before the 20th century, and of course this can be traced back to the Elizabethan Poor Law, and that's the argument of some of the scholars who defend this thesis. As far as the second period is concerned, the Victorian age, the nature, scope and character of the state and consequently of government changed in the Victorian period. State activity prompted by industrial change, precisely because of the great changes that were operating in society at the time. Social and economic changes stimulated government activity and intervention as, on the one hand, more opportunities, wealth and facilities were created, and, on the other hand, there was the need to regulate, rationalize and discipline the course of such development. So there were both advantages, because people had access to more things and more opportunities, generally speaking, but then on the other hand, there was also the need to organize all these changes that were taking place in society. And that is why there was a great increase in state activity, and a lot of scholars identify this period, the Victorian age, broadly speaking, as the origins of the welfare state in England. Then the Liberal government itself, from 1905 to 1915, despite the fact that concerns with poverty and state intervention were not original at this time, the motivations behind them, the social and political context in which they were developed, the objectives, and especially the extent of their implementation in the first decade of the 20th century were certainly unparalleled. Last but not least, and this is probably the period which gathers more consensus amongst academics regarding the origins of the welfare state. It has to do with the initiatives of the Labour Party from 1945 to 1950, and very specifically to the Beveridge Report, which was written by William Beveridge in 1942 and aimed at eliminating poverty, proposed a system of social security to be managed by the state, and then it was later on somehow implemented in the program of the Labour Party in 1945. So as this was the post-war period, and to a certain extent the measures were more systematized and greater than the ones before, at the turn of the century, a lot of academics identify this period as the official, let's say, the official origin of the welfare state in England. However, the eruption of welfare thinking first took place in the first decade of the 20th century. The expression welfare state was only first used in the 1930s. So we cannot say that at the turn of the century people were actually thinking of implementing a welfare state. The expression did not exist. However, the measures which took place and carried out by the government somehow preceded the ones which would later be implemented in the middle of the century and which were associated to the already existing expression at this time of welfare state. Moreover, the intellectual origins of the welfare state were closely linked to the neoliberalism, especially as expressed by L.T. Hobhouse, that is, the apology of the need for social reform, which required the redefinition of the roles of the individual, society and the state, and assumed the existence of cooperative relationship between these three entities. So even though we might agree that the official beginning of the welfare state in England happened in the middle of the 20th century, the truth is that this line of thinking started to be more systematized at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, with the neoliberals, especially with Leonard Hobhouse and also with Hobson. Actually, a very well-known academic who studies liberalism and the neoliberalism in specific, Peter Weiler, stated that nothing accomplished by the Labour government of 1945 would have shocked Hobhouse or failed to receive his approval or on liberal grounds. So in a way, what happened in the middle of the 20th century was, according to many scholars, the continuation of something the neoliberals had started at the turn of the century. In a speech delivered to the House of Commons in June 1914, the Prime Minister, Asquith, expressed the opinion that social reform had come to stay. And this is a quote of the speech given by the Prime Minister. The figures which I have already given speak for themselves. What is the main cause for the residue of our growing expenditure? Is it the money which we are spending on old age pensions, labour exchanges, national insurance and education, and some minor branches of what is called social reform? Nothing can be more certain that they, meaning those forms of expenditure, have come to stay. No substantial reduction in any one of them is possible to any government of whatever political party or political complexion it may be. So these measures, which were new at the time, the old age pensions, labor exchanges, national insurance and education, especially the way they were carried out, have come to stay. Those were the words of the Prime Minister at the time, and actually they have come to stay, and they did stay, and later on there was the confirmation in the middle of the 20th century. So my last, just to finish, there is this lack of consensus regarding the origin of the welfare state, but there are 4 main periods which are pointed out. The Elizabethan Poor Law, the Victorian Age, and then the Liberal government from 1905 to 1915, and the last one will be the labour initiatives in the middle of the 20th century. And somehow they are all partially correct. That is probably why there is not a consensus. But in the end, I would stress the relevance of the Liberal Party and the surge in welfare thinking and the speed in the growing of social measures in order to improve people's living conditions, which were later on confirmed in the middle of the century.